talks that are actually going on around campus this week and at the beginning of next week. The IB seminar tomorrow at 4 is Robert Rickliffs from the University of Missouri at St. Louis, who's going to be speaking on parental investment and the life history of birds. The Wildlife and Conservation Biology seminar on Friday at noon is by Laura Prue from ESPM, and the title is Cattle versus Endangered Kangaroo Rats, Optimizing Multi-Use Management in the Carrizo National Monument, California. And the ESPM Colloquium on Monday at 4 is Brian Fisher from the CalAcad, and also from ESPM, I guess he must have an adjunct appointment there, who is going to be speaking on Save an Ant, Save a Planet, the race to discover Madagascar's biodiversity. So, well, it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Kevin and Queiroz today. And this is the continuation of our year-long celebration of the centennial of the MVZ. And so we've had this really amazing opportunity to bring people in who graduated or were otherwise associated with the MVZ during their formative years. And obviously we've had really a who's who list of speakers so far this year, and Kevin definitely is going to be continuing that tradition. And it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Kevin because he was my postdoc advisor at the Smithsonian. Kevin did his PhD, well, he did his undergraduate at UCLA, and he did his master's at San Diego State, and I did my master's at San Diego State, so I'm really proud of the fact that we both went there. And then he came here to do his PhD, and he worked with Dave Wake. And you know that Kevin must have been a really impressive student because Dave accepted him even though he wasn't working on salamanders. So while Kevin was here, he worked on sand lizard phylogenetics and evolutionary biology. And then after he left Berkeley, he did a postdoc at the CalAcad. And then since that time, he's been a curator at the Smithsonian. And Kevin is, I think he's probably best known for his work in the realm of philosophy of science and species. What are species, the philosophy of species, that sort of thing. But he also has a very well-established empirical program as well, working primarily on the phylogenetics and evolution of iguanian lizards of various sorts. But today, I think he's going to be taking us down maybe the more philosophical route, and the title of his talk is a really complicated one, Naming Clades. So Kevin, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Jim. I just wanted to say that it's an honor to be invited to speak in this special series of museum lunch seminars commemorating the centennial of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. I'd like to thank Craig for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry he can't be here. And also Dave Wake, my PhD advisor for, among many other things, accepting me and advising me as a graduate student so that I can now count myself as an MVZ alumnus. I have lots of fond memories of my graduate school days in the museum, so it's also a pleasure to be invited back to interact with old friends and new ones, members of my extended academic family. I'm afraid I'm going to have to start with an apology. For the last couple of years, I've done less and less empirical research, mostly just a few phylogenetic studies of some small lizard clades, including continuing work on the group that I studied for my doctoral research. I considered talking about one or more of those studies, but decided against it on the grounds that many of you are conducting conceptually similar studies and are doing them in more sophisticated ways than I am. So instead, I decided to talk about the thing that's occupied most of my time recently, which happens also to trace back to other work that I started while in graduate school at the MVZ. And I'm referring here to the topic of naming clades. I got involved in this area as a result of research that I was doing both before and during my tenure at the MVZ on the higher level phylogeny of squamate reptiles. Much of my work on naming clades has been done in collaboration with Jacques Gauthier, who was a senior graduate student in the UC Museum of Paleontology when I started at Berkeley, and is now a professor at Yale University. Jacques and I became collaborators as a result of mutual collaborations with the late Richard Estes, a vertebrate paleontologist at San Diego State University, with whom both Jacques and I worked closely while studying for our master's degrees. And Richard was also a Berkeley graduate, having received his PhD from the former paleontology department in 1960. And just for fun, that last photo was of me in my MVZ office back in 1984. This was around the time that I started thinking more seriously about naming clades. And this is just an outline of my talk. The first thing I'll do is present a description and brief history of the clade concept. Next, I'll describe explicit methods for applying names to clades. which form the basis of a novel approach called phylogenetic nomenclature. Third, I'll discuss the roots of phylogenetic nomenclature, by which I mean its sort of conceptual predecessors, developments that set the stage for the new approach to naming. Fourth, I'll describe the history and main properties of a proposed code of nomenclature based on the new methods, which is commonly referred to as the PhyloCode. Then I'll address some common criticisms of this approach, explaining why I think they're misguided. And finally, I'll talk about future directions, in particular about the development of an integrated approach to naming clades. So let's start with the clade concept. The clade has become an important concept in evolutionary biology, though it emerged sort of gradually. Darwin proposed that all true classification is genealogical, that the arrangement of groups must be strictly genealogical to be natural. His disciple Ernst Haeckel, who coined the term phylogeny, distinguished between monophyletic groups, which had a single origin, and polyphyletic groups, which had multiple origins. And by the middle of the 20th century, it had become widely accepted that monophyletic groups were strictly genealogical, and thus qualified as natural taxa, but that polyphyletic groups were not. During that same era, the term clade was coined by Julian Huxley to distinguish monophyletic units, the products of cladogenesis, from levels of anagenetic advancement, which he termed grades. And Huxley considered most higher taxa to be both grades and clades, except that polyphyletic groups were considered grades but not clades. Around the same time, Willy Hennig observed that the monophyletic groups of earlier authors consisted of two distinct types of groups, those that included all the descendants of the single ancestor in which the group originated, and those that included only some of the descendants of that ancestor. And he proposed to restrict the term monophyletic to the groups including all of the descendants, and proposed the term paraphyletic for those including only some of the descendants. Now, Hennig's distinction was widely accepted, though some authors objected to his terminology, preferring to use monophyly in Haeckel's original sense, that is, for groups having a single origin, and in terming the groups that Hennig called monophyletic, the ones including all of the descendants of the common ancestors, are holophyletic. In any case, the term clade has come to be associated with those groups that include all the descendants of the ancestor in which the group originated, those that are monophyletic in this holophyletic sense. And this is just a graphic representation of the three different kinds of groups. For each diagram, the black dots indicate members of the group, and the gray dots indicate non-members. One way to conceptualize the distinctions is by relating them to clades. So a holophyletic group in the top diagram, that is a monophyletic group in Hennig's sense, is equivalent to a single entire clade. A polyphyletic group in the bottom left consists of two or more distinct clades. And a paraphyletic group on the bottom right is an incomplete clade, since some of the members of the clade, in this particular case just this one, are not included. In any case, the point is that formally named higher taxa, those traditionally ranked as genera on up, have been increasingly equated with clades. Almost nobody now advocates recognizing polyphyletic groups as formal higher taxa, and the number of people who advocate recognizing paraphyletic groups seems to be decreasing with each new academic generation. I don't really have time to get into the arguments about this issue, but I do want to say one thing about it. It seems to me that the trend toward equating higher taxa with clades is closely tied to the status of systematics as a science. And I say this because the removal of certain descendants that results in a paraphyletic group is most commonly justified on the basis of the perceived importance of certain derived characters possessed by those descendants that are removed from the clade. And this judgment about the importance of characters is largely subjective and is therefore not very amenable to scientific testing. It's part of the reason that taxonomy has often been characterized as being as much an art as a science. In contrast, equating higher taxa with clades eliminates the option of removing descendants from their clades, and therefore also removes the subjective elements that were used to justify that removal. Moreover, the status of any given group as a clade is highly amenable to scientific testing. one can now conduct rigorous phylogenetic analyses to address this issue, including explicit tests of hypotheses that particular sets of species correspond to clades. So what about naming clades? The problem here is that traditional rules governing the names of higher taxa don't work very well for clades. They work okay for the initial christening, that is, for the original application of a name to a clade. The problem is that names don't necessarily remain associated with the same clades. And the reason is that traditional methods are strongly tied to the taxonomic ranks of the so-called Linnaean hierarchy, the familiar series of categories from kingdom to genus to which clades are commonly assigned, or more specifically from superfamily to subgenus, since the methods in question don't apply to taxa above the rank of superfamily, at least in zoology. The methods for applying names can be thought of as definitions, and in traditional nomenclature, those definitions are based on ranks. For example, the name iguanidae is implicitly defined as the family containing the genus Iguana. As a consequence of its rank-based methods of definition, names in traditional nomenclature are more strongly associated with ranks than they are with clades. And therefore, when ranks are changed, names remain associated with the same ranks, even if this means changing their associations to different clades. So in this diagram, when the rank of family is shifted from the smaller group containing only B and C on the left to this larger group containing groups A, B, and C on the right, that name, iguanidae, also shifts its reference to the larger clade. And that's true even though the clade with which it was originally associated, BC, is still present. So in contrast to the rank-based definitions of traditional nomenclature, Jacques Gauthier and I proposed some general methods for specifying the meanings or references of taxon names in terms not of ranks, but of ancestry and descent. I've illustrated here the three basic methods that we propose, which we now call node-based, branch-based, and apomorphy-based definitions. Node-based definitions, on the left there, associate a taxon name with a clade originating at the node, indicated by the black dot on the tree on the left, that represents the most recent common ancestor of two specified descendants. They take the general form, the clade originating with the last common ancestor of B and C, where B and C are smaller clade species or specimens. Branch-based definitions associate a taxon name with the clade stemming from the split of one lineage, represented by a branch or internode on the phylogenetic tree, from another lineage. And they take the general form, the clade originating with the first ancestor of B that's not an ancestor of A, where A and B again are smaller clade species or specimens. And finally, apomorphy-based definitions associate a taxon name with a clade stemming from the first species in which a particular derived character or apomorphy evolved. And they take the general form, the clade originating with the first ancestor of C to evolve X, where C is once again a smaller clade species or specimen, and X is a derived character state. Now, in contrast to the situation under traditional nomenclature, in which names are more strongly associated with ranks than with clades, under these phylogenetic definitions, names are more strongly associated with clades than with ranks. And thus, when ranks are changed, names remain associated with the same clades, even if this means changing their associations to different ranks. So in this diagram, where iguanidae is defined as the clade originating with the last common ancestor of B and C, this name remains associated with the same clade, BC, when the rank of that clade is changed from family, in this diagram, to something below the rank of family in this one. And so therefore, the choice between phylogenetic and traditional approaches boils down to what one considers more important, clades or ranks. And given that most biologists agree that ranks are largely arbitrary, well, the clade is now considered a fundamental category in biology. It seems appropriate to adopt an approach that's consistent with the greater theoretical significance of clades. That approach is now commonly termed phylogenetic nomenclature, which I'll also refer to as PN for short. It's an approach to biological nomenclature, which is the general discipline concerned with the names of biological taxa. Specifically, phylogenetic nomenclature is an approach that applies names to taxa based on methods, the phylogenetic definitions that I just described, that specify the references of names in terms of common ancestry and descent. And because its methods are based on ancestry and descent rather than on ranks, another property of phylogenetic nomenclature is that it de-emphasizes the taxonomic ranks. However, this does not mean that ranks are prohibited. It only means that because ranks aren't involved in the application of taxon names, they're necessarily less important. But phylogenetic nomenclature is not the same thing as rank-free taxonomy. It's also worth mentioning that phylogenetic nomenclature represents a tree-based approach to biological nomenclature. As many of you are probably aware, over the last several decades, biology has experienced what might be considered a phylogenetic revolution. The estimation of phylogenies has become a major area of research, including initiatives to reconstruct the tree of life of all living species. In addition, phylogenies are now considered fundamental to answering all sorts of biological questions, such as those involving correlations between different characters or between characters and environments. And just as those methods represent a tree-based approach to comparative biology, the methods of PN represent a tree-based approach to biological nomenclature. Okay, so now I'd like to digress briefly to talk about the roots of phylogenetic nomenclature. My purpose here is to place the ideas that I've been describing in a historical context and to illustrate that these ideas are part of a general historical trend in which trees are increasingly emphasized and ranks increasingly de-emphasized. Now, I've already discussed some history when I described the emergence of the clade concept, so now I'm going to take up where I left off, which is with the increasing acceptance of the proposition that higher taxa are to be equated with monophyletic groups in Hennig's sense, that is, with clades. Hennig was an influential thinker in this area, and another important insight of his that set the stage for phylogenetic nomenclature was his recognition of three different ways in which the references of higher taxon names are commonly conceptualized. In current terms, these are as stems, apomorphies, and crowns. Hennig himself talked about three different meanings of the origin of the group. First, the time corresponding to the initial divergence of one group represented by extant or recent organisms from another such group. This divergence is represented by T1 in this slide and corresponds to the origin of the stem lineage of the group in question. Second, the time corresponding to the origin of the characteristic feature or features possessed by members of the group. That would be T2, corresponding with the origin of one or more apomorphies. And third, the time corresponding to the earliest divergence between the extant members of the group. T3, corresponding to the origin of the crown. The groups corresponding to these three times of origin are special cases of the branch-based, apomorphy-based, and node-based categories of phylogenetic definitions that I described earlier. Another important development that set the stage for phylogenetic nomenclature was a tendency to de-emphasize the categorical ranks of the so-called Linnaean hierarchy. As I noted earlier, one of the characteristics of PN is a de-emphasis on ranks. However, the tendency to de-emphasize ranks preceded this nomenclatural movement. It happened in response to a proliferation of ranks that occurred as a consequence of increasing knowledge both about species diversity, sheer numbers of species, and also about phylogeny. If you don't remember, Linnaeus himself used only 5 ranks. By the mid-20th century, the number had grown to about 20. And since that time, at least as many additional ranks have been added or proposed. And the de-emphasis on ranks was at least partly a reaction to this proliferation of ranks and manifested itself in several ways. One was the use of numerical prefixes instead of named ranks, and once again Hennig was at the forefront. This is Hennig's classification from his 1969 book on insect phylogeny, illustrating the use of numerical prefixes instead of categorical ranks to indicate hierarchical relationships. And incidentally, contrary to common criticisms of these prefixes, they're not intended to be formal replacements for ranks. In other words, you would never memorize that Archaeognatha is 2.1 the way you might have memorized that this taxon is commonly ranked as an order. Instead, the numerical prefixes are just devices for representing relationships without using formal ranks. And as such, their values don't have any particular significance and can therefore differ from one taxonomy to another. Another manifestation of the de-emphasis on ranks was the use of the sequence of taxa in a list to represent hierarchical relationships, as in the sequence taxonomy on the left of this slide. The traditional approach was to use a nested series of ranked groups instead, as in the subordinated taxonomy on the right. This sequencing method was proposed by Gareth Nelson and came to be known as phyletic sequencing, and it was used to reduce the number of categorical ranks. What you should notice is that only 2 ranks are used in the sequence taxonomy as opposed to 6 in the subordinated one. A third manifestation was the plesion proposal of Colin Patterson and Don Rosen. The plesion is basically a rankless category used for extinct taxa. It's used in conjunction with phyletic sequencing, at least for the fossil forms, and again helps to reduce the number of taxonomic ranks. This slide illustrates the taxonomy of some fishes using the plesion category from Patterson and Rosen's 1977 paper. And the rankless nature of the plesion category is evident from the fact that although these authors subscribe to the rule that sister taxa must always have the same rank, a plesion can be the sister group of a taxon at any rank. In this example, you can see that different taxa assigned to the plesion category are the sisters of 2 super cohorts, 2 suborders in a family. So these historical developments that I've just discussed, along with a more general increasing emphasis on the estimation and use of phylogenetic trees, set the stage for the idea of defining taxon names phylogenetically. Now, it could be said that people had already been defining names phylogenetically, at least implicitly, when they assigned names to groups illustrated on phylogenetic trees. But what they hadn't done was to formulate those references as explicit verbal definitions, and even more importantly, they hadn't recognized the nomenclatural implications of such definitions. Those implications, as I described earlier, owe to the fact that phylogenetic definitions differ from the implicit definitions adopted in the rank-based systems, the systems that underlie the traditional bacteriological, botanical, and zoological codes. Traditional definitions of taxon names are formulated in terms of taxonomic ranks, as well as types, included taxa or specimens that serve as reference points for the definitions. This sort of definition differs fundamentally from a phylogenetic definition, which is stated not in terms of ranks and types, but in terms of clades and specifiers, taxa or organisms that are roughly analogous to types and serving as reference points for the definitions. The examples here are similar to the ones that I showed earlier. As a consequence of these differences, again, as I described earlier, names under rank-based traditional nomenclature are more closely associated with ranks than with clades. While in contrast, names under phylogenetic nomenclature are more closely associated with clades than with ranks. So phylogenetic definitions form the core or foundation of phylogenetic nomenclature, but there have also been some other developments in this field. I just wanted to mention 3 that represent important differences from and possibly advantages over traditional rank-based nomenclature. The first one is Harold Bryant's proposal of what he called a designated phylogenetic context. Bryant suggested that we might want certain names to be used only in particular phylogenetic contexts. For example, we might want to use the name Pinnipedia, a name traditionally applied to a group composed of the marine mammals, seals, sea lions, and walruses, only in the context of phylogenies in which these 3 taxa form a clade that excludes all terrestrial mammals. In other words, if the phylogeny suggested that seals, sea lions, and walruses were not one another's closest relatives, we might prefer not to use the name Pinnipedia at all, rather than applying it to a group that includes terrestrial mammals such as ferrets and bears. And Bryant called the phylogenies under which it would be acceptable to use a particular name a designated phylogenetic context. Now, taking this idea a step further, Mike Lee noted that this designated phylogenetic context could be built directly into the definition as what we now call a qualifying clause. For example, we could define the name Pinnipedia as referring to the clade originating from the last common ancestor of seals, sea lions, and walruses under the condition that ferrets and bears are not descended from that ancestor. And this definition would have the effect of nullifying the name Pinnipedia in the context of phylogenies in which seals, sea lions, and walruses don't form a clade that excludes ferrets and bears. Other developments that I want to mention are some additional variants of the basic types of phylogenetic definitions. These particular variants were developed specifically for tying names to crown clades in cases where the internal or external relationships of the crowns are poorly known. They're known as branch-modified and apomorphy-modified node-based definitions. I won't discuss these types of definitions further. Instead, I just want to point out that both these types of definitions and those that employ qualifying clauses give authors greater control over how the names they propose will be applied in the context of new phylogenetic hypotheses. In other words, they allow authors to define names so that those names will continue to refer to the clades to which they were originally intended to refer. The last development that I want to mention is the mathematical representation of phylogenetic definitions, which was described by Mike Kesey last year in Zoologica Scripta. This approach permits the automated application of phylogenetically defined names, that is, by computers. Kesey developed his methods for the specific purpose of applying names on trees. However, similar approaches have been developed apparently independent of phylogenetic nomenclature in software packages designed for various sorts of phylogenetic analyses. For example, both the software package Bayes Traits by Mark Pagel and the package PhyloMapper by Alan Lemon incorporate methods that are equivalent to node-based phylogenetic definitions. So the ideas that I've been talking about gave rise to the field of phylogenetic nomenclature, and at some point this field reached a critical stage in its development. Now the theory was in place and was being put into practice. However, lacking an official code of phylogenetic nomenclature, people who wanted to use the methods faced a difficult situation. If they chose to use the methods, their nomenclatural acts would have no official status, the way that analogous acts would if the authors chose to follow one of the traditional codes. Consequently, other authors, even those who adopted the phylogenetic approach, could ignore those acts. In fact, lacking a code of its own, phylogenetic nomenclature itself could be ignored. Or worse yet, it could be prohibited, for example, by journal editors on the grounds that it lacked the official sanction of the code. And for these reasons, some of the advocates of phylogenetic nomenclature, Michael Donohue and Phil Cantino in particular, decided that it was time to begin preparing an official code of phylogenetic nomenclature. The first draft of such a code, now commonly referred to as the PhyloCode, was completed by Phil and myself in the summer of 1998. The draft was modified in light of decisions made at a workshop held later that same year, and the first public draft was posted on the internet in April 2000 with an open invitation to comment on it. As a result of feedback from the scientific community, as well as an appointed advisory group and a more recently elected committee, the PhyloCode was revised several more times between 2000 and the present. The important point here is that the draft PhyloCode has been maturing for roughly 10 years. It's been revised numerous times as a result of input from both advocates and critics. Further revisions are currently being drafted, but the PhyloCode has now reached a stage where we think it's close to being ready to be ratified and published so that it will have official status and become a functioning code. In fact, the manuscript has recently been accepted for publication by the University of California Press. In terms of its basic goals and organization, the PhyloCode has a lot in common with the traditional rank-based codes. It was partly modeled on the draft biocode, and it borrows several general concepts and principles from the botanical and zoological codes. For example, it shares with the traditional rank-based code the general goals of promoting nomenclatural clarity, universality, and stability. Clarity just means that the references of taxon names are unambiguous in the context of a given phylogeny. Universality means that everyone uses the same names for the same taxa, again in the context of a given phylogeny. And stability means that the names don't change over time. at least to the extent that concepts of taxa stay the same. Now, although the PhyloCode shares these basic goals with the traditional codes, advocates of phylogenetic nomenclature argue that the PhyloCode does a better job of achieving them for reasons that I described earlier. The PhyloCode is also organized roughly similarly to the rank-based codes, being made up of principles, rules, and recommendations. The principles describe the most fundamental tenets of the system, while the rules and recommendations are the mechanisms for putting the principles into practice. Now, I don't have time to go over all the various principles, rules, and recommendations, so I'll just summarize what I consider the most important general properties of the system. All of these properties are also analogous to those in the rank-based codes, though their application to specific cases will often lead to different conclusions because of the fundamental difference in how the names are defined. For example, just as in the case of the rank-based codes, a fundamental principle of the PhyloCode is freedom of taxonomic judgment. And what this means is that the PhyloCode only regulates the application of names. It doesn't regulate taxonomic practices. In other words, it does not determine which groups are to be recognized. It only determines which names are to be applied to those groups. This freedom of taxonomic judgment extends to the issues of categorical ranks, analytical methods, and hypotheses about composition. In the first case, the system is rankless, but this only means that ranks have no bearing on the application of names. It does not, contrary to a common misconception, forbid the use of ranks. Similarly, the PhyloCode is only concerned with how names are applied given a particular phylogeny. It places no restrictions on the analytical methods that are used to reconstruct or estimate the relevant phylogenies, nor does it dictate the standards by which particular relationships are judged to be adequately supported. And likewise, inferences about the composition of taxa are not regulated by the PhyloCode, but are left to the judgment of systematists. Other main properties of the system represented by the PhyloCode are also similar or analogous to those in the traditional codes. Nomenclatural clarity, for example, is achieved through the use of explicit definitions, which, at least if properly formulated, allow names to be applied unambiguously to taxa. Of course, this property is the one in which the PhyloCode differs most fundamentally from the rank-based codes in that it uses these phylogenetic rather than rank-based definitions. The other basic properties are more or less the same as in rank-based nomenclature. Universality, for example, is achieved by precedence, a ranking or ordering of the various names and their definitions that dictates which name is to be used in cases involving synonyms, that is, different names that refer to the same taxon, or which definition is to be used in cases involving homonyms, different taxa that are referred to by the same name. As in the rank-based codes, precedence is normally determined by priority, the chronological order of publication, with earlier published names and definitions having precedence over later published ones. And finally, in certain cases, priority can be set aside or overruled if doing so promotes stability. And this is achieved by conservation of a later published name definition combination over an earlier published one. And conservation allows the correction of unintended changes in the references of names that are caused by poorly formulated definitions or unanticipated phylogenetic hypotheses. Okay, next I'd like to address some common criticisms of phylogenetic nomenclature. First, that phylogenetic nomenclature is undesirable because it will supposedly result in chaos. Second, that PN is unnecessary because the traditional system works perfectly well for naming monophyletic groups. And third, that PN is ineffectual, that contrary to the claims of its supporters, the approach does not promote stability. So now let me address these criticisms. Although it's been asserted repeatedly that PN will result in chaos, this criticism is fairly non-specific and unsubstantiated. Sometimes it's stated or implied that PN is an attempt to change most or all taxon names, and in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Most names wouldn't change at all. Instead, it's the rules governing the application of names that would change. And the rules that I'm talking about are those that are described in the various codes of nomenclature, which most biologists are only vaguely familiar with. And as a consequence, I think there's little reason to think that that changing those rules would greatly disrupt biology. In addition, because of a confusion with rank-free taxonomy, there seems to be a fear that PN would eliminate the use of the traditional taxonomic ranks. On the contrary, as I noted earlier, PN does not forbid the use of ranks, it only makes nomenclature independent of them. If desired, ranks can still be used in their original taxonomic function. And finally, the adoption of PN will actually result in less chaos than occurs under the traditional codes, in that the associations between names and clades will be more stable. If anything, it's the traditional codes that are propelling us into an era of nomenclatural chaos, chaos that's resulting from trying to deal with a wealth of new phylogenetic information using rank-based rather than tree-based methods. Let me illustrate this with an example involving cockroaches and vertebrates. I know this is the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, and I study vertebrates myself, but I really like this example. Traditionally, roaches, Blatodia or Blattaria, and termites, Isoptera, have been considered to form mutually exclusive groups, which is reflected in their traditional treatment as separate orders, as illustrated in this taxonomy. However, recent phylogenetic analyses indicate with strong support that termites are nested within roaches, as illustrated in this diagram. So here are the roaches, and sort of this clade here, and the termites here are nested right within the roaches. So to reflect this new hypothesis of relationships under the rank-based system, this new taxonomy, termites have been demoted from a separate order to a family of roaches, which results in two types of changes indicated on this slide by blue for changes in composition and red for changes in names. So first, the composition of Blatodia has changed in that it now includes Isoptera, and this change is necessary to reflect the new hypothesis of relationships. Second, the termite clade changes its name from Isoptera to Termitidae. In addition, all the former termite families are lowered in rank to subfamilies, so they also have to change their names. And this is just the tip of the iceberg because the name changes cascade down to the former subfamilies, which aren't shown here, which are now ranked as tribes, as well as to the former tribes, also not shown, which are now ranked as subtribes. Notice also that the name Termitidae has undergone a major change in reference. Formerly, it was the name of one of 7 termite subclades, but now it refers to the entire termite clade. So Termitidae is now equivalent to what used to be Isoptera. And all these name changes, the ones indicated in red, are counterproductive, particularly given that the composition of the groups has remained entirely unchanged. Now let's consider how things would work under phylogenetic nomenclature, as illustrated in this far right taxonomy. Suppose that these same names had been given standard phylogenetic definitions based on the species originally included in the name taxa. If so, then Blatodia would again experience a change in composition, indicated by blue, since it would now include Isoptera. However, none of the name changes that occurred under the rank-based approach would occur. Isoptera would still be the name of the termite clade, and all of the names originally associated with the termite subclades that were ranked as families, as well as subfamilies and tribes, would continue to refer to the same clades. And this example, I think, illustrates pretty clearly that it's really the traditional rank-based approach, not the phylogenetic one, that causes nomenclatural chaos. The second criticism is that phylogenetic nomenclature is unnecessary, that the traditional approach can be used to apply names to monophyletic taxa, that is, clades. Now, of course, this is true. Because taxonomy and nomenclature are at least partly independent, the principle of monophyly, a taxonomic principle, can be adopted in conjunction with either rank-based or phylogenetic nomenclature. But this does not mean that both systems function equally well in this context. What the perpetrators of this criticism don't seem to appreciate is that although names can be applied to clades using rank-based nomenclature, the names don't necessarily remain associated with the same clade. They ignore the fact that a particular name will often change its reference from one clade to another when new ranks are proposed. In effect, they act as though the only thing that's important is that all names refer to clades. As long as a name refers to some clade, it doesn't seem to matter which clade it refers to, that is, as long as it includes the type. The phylogenetic approach, in contrast, goes a step further in associating names with clades. Not only are names applied to clades, but they're defined in such a way that they should remain associated with the same clades as long as the same clades are inferred. So although it's true that traditional nomenclature can be used to name clades, it doesn't work very well for this purpose. Phylogenetic nomenclature does a better job of maintaining the associations between names and clades. The final criticism of PN that I want to address is the claim that PN does not really promote stability. Before discussing an example, I want to point out that what the critics are talking about here is stability in terms of taxon composition. It's also important to understand that to function properly, a nomenclatural system should not maintain stability at all costs. Instead, a properly functioning system should maintain stability, that is, in terms of composition, when hypotheses about relationships are stable, or at least the relevant parts of those hypotheses. And it should allow compositional changes, or it should allow composition to change in an appropriate way when hypotheses about relationships change. Now, in this context, it's important to realize that under the traditional system, there are two sources of compositional instability: changes in hypotheses about relationships, and also changes in ranks. And in contrast, phylogenetic nomenclature has only one source of instability: changes in hypotheses about relationships. Advocates of PN argue that this is the only type of instability that should be tolerated, that instability resulting solely from changes in ranks is both unnecessary and undesirable. So let's now consider an example cited by critics of phylogenetic nomenclature to illustrate the instability in the system. In this example, the name Mammalia is defined phylogenetically as a clade originating with the most recent common ancestor of platypuses, representing the monotremes, and humans, representing the therians, the placentals and marsupials. The multituberculates, an extinct group, are traditionally considered to be mammals and are placed as the sister group of therians in some phylogenetic hypotheses. That example on the left. But suppose that a new phylogenetic analysis places multituberculates as the sister group to a clade composed of both monotremes and therians, as in the diagram on the right. If this new phylogenetic hypothesis were to be accepted, then according to the stated phylogenetic definition, multituberculates would not be mammals. If so, then the composition of Mammalia would have changed. In this sense, it would have been unstable. Now, nobody disputes that this is the way that phylogenetic nomenclature works. The difference is in how different people view the situation. Some people consider it a problem, a reason for rejecting phylogenetic nomenclature. Others don't consider it a problem at all, or if there is a problem, it's one that can easily be solved in the context of PN. Let me explain why. First, multituberculates are all extinct. And while it's true that multituberculates have traditionally been considered mammals, it's not at all clear that we want to force them to be mammals, no matter what the phylogeny is. Or what if they turned out to be even more distantly related to the other mammals than in the diagram that I illustrated? The point is that the phylogenetic definition uses, the phylogenetic definition used in this example allows multituberculates to be mammals or not, depending on whether they're descended from the specified ancestor. That is, depending on their phylogenetic relationships. And that would seem to be a desirable thing. Second, if you really wanted to force multituberculates to be mammals, this is also possible under PN. All you have to do is include a multituberculate as one of the internal specifiers in the phylogenetic definition. In other words, instead of using the definition, the least inclusive clade containing platypuses and humans, we could use the definition, the least inclusive clade containing platypuses, humans, and Tylotus medivus, which is a multituberculate. This definition guarantees that multituberculates will be mammals no matter which phylogenetic hypothesis is accepted. It guarantees this stability regarding the inclusion of multituberculates within Mammalia. Now, this possibility reveals that the criticism in question is not really a criticism of phylogenetic nomenclature, but only of a particular phylogenetic definition. In other words, even if you consider the exclusion of multituberculates from Mammalia to be a problem, the problem is with the specific definition used in this example. It's not a general problem with the approach. Third, there are other types of definitions that would retain multituberculates within Mammalia under that second phylogenetic hypothesis without requiring them to be mammals. Some of the critics of PN characterize it as a node-pointing system and direct their criticisms at node-based phylogenetic definitions, like the one I've been using in this example. But these criticisms ignore the fact that there are other kinds of phylogenetic definitions. One of the reasons that multituberculates are traditionally included within Mammalia is that they share several apomorphies with living mammals. And if you wanted to tie the name Mammalia to one of these apomorphies instead of to that crown node, you could use an apomorphy-based definition. This would again allow multituberculates to be mammals without requiring them to be mammals, depending on whether they possess the specified apomorph. But I want to acknowledge that let's suppose that the original phylogenetic definition of the name Mammalia resulted in the exclusion of marsupials rather than multituberculates under certain phylogenetic hypotheses. And perhaps everyone agrees that this definition contradicts the goal of stability, implying that the inclusion of marsupials within Mammalia is somehow more fundamental to the concept of Mammalia than the inclusion of multituberculates. The problem is that the definition under consideration might have priority. To solve this problem, we would need a mechanism for overriding priority so that we could propose a new definition and have it be the one with precedence, even though it's not the oldest. The traditional codes have mechanisms for actions of this kind, which are known as acts of conservation, and so does the PhyloCode. So in sum, the supposed problems concerning instability under phylogenetic nomenclature are exaggerated. The changes in hypothesized composition pointed out by the critics are not necessarily undesirable, given that they reflect changes in ideas about relationships, and analogous types of changes occur under the traditional system. Moreover, they can be prevented using different phylogenetic definitions. In fact, these criticisms are really criticisms of particular phylogenetic definitions rather than of the phylogenetic approach to nomenclature itself. Okay, so the last thing that I want to mention concerns some possible future directions, in particular the possibility of developing an integrated system of clade names. Now, traditional nomenclature has an integrated system in the sense that the names of certain nested taxa are based on the same name, that is, the type genus. The names differ, of course, in terms of their standard rank signifying endings. In zoology, for example, we have OIDEA ending for superfamilies, IDAE for families, and INAE for subfamilies. Now, it seems pretty clear that the taxonomic ranks are not the most relevant categories for modern biology, but if we were to try to develop an integrated system of clade names based on categories with greater significance, what might they be? The most obvious candidates derive from Henig's distinction between the three different meanings of the origin of a group of extant organisms, which we now describe as the stem or total clade, an apomorphy, and the crown. I don't have time to get into the history of ideas about naming these clades, including the different possibilities and their various advantages and disadvantages. So instead, I'm just going to describe the only proposal that's been developed in any detail. That proposal has two main parts. First, the most widely used name is applied to the crown clade, which is generally also the best studied and therefore most commonly discussed group, given that both branches of the basal divergence have living descendants. Second, the name of the larger clade going back to the origin of the stem lineage, which has been called the total clade or pan-monophyllum, is formed by combining the name of the crown with a standard prefix or suffix. The one that's been proposed is the prefix pan, derived from that term pan-monophyllum. In addition, intermediate clades associated with the origins of various apomorphies are given names that describe the corresponding apomorphies. The main complication arises when the most widely used name also describes an apomorphy, and in those cases the name of the apomorphy clade is formed by combining the name of the crown with a standard prefix or suffix. The one that's been proposed is the prefix apo, for obvious reasons. Here's an example using birds. The most widely used name aves or aves, is applied to the crown clade, that is, to the least inclusive crown clade containing all extant birds. The name of the corresponding total clade, which is formed by combining the name of the crown with the prefix pan, would be pan aves. It includes aves and all extinct species that share a more recent common ancestor with living birds than with any other living organisms. And of course, many of these species are also members of a less inclusive clade named Dinosauria. One of the apomorphies commonly considered important in the origin of birds is that of wings and flight. The clade associated with that apomorphy could be called aviali, meaning bird wing, or some other name that describes the apomorphy more specifically. Corresponding vernacular names could also be developed, and I proposed using the best known vernacular name, in this case, birds, at least in English, modified with the appropriate adjective. So, for example, we would talk about crown birds for the members of the crown clade, pan birds for the members of the total clade. The intermediate apomorphy-based clades, for those clades we would use names such as feathered birds, bipedal birds, winged birds, short-tailed birds, toothless birds, etc. Another useful term is stem birds, which refers to the set of all organisms that are members of the total clade, but not of the crown. And of course, those are all extinct. In addition to increased nomenclatural precision, an integrated system of clade names has several advantages. One of them is cognitive efficiency. The system is efficient because knowing the name of a crown automatically means knowing the name of its corresponding total clade, and vice versa. Thus, for all crown clade total clade pairs, this situation effectively reduces the number of names that one needs to remember by half. A related benefit is that the integrated approach facilitates communication among biologists who study distantly related taxa. For example, currently, most botanists and entomologists probably have no idea what are the names of the total clades of even such familiar crowns as Mammalia and Crocodilia. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if most vertebrate biologists don't know them. In contrast, under an integrated system, the names of these total clades would be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the names of the crowns. Yet another advantage of the integrated approach is that it results in a broader concept of origins, at least for distinctive clades of living organisms. Under traditional approaches, the best known names are commonly associated with particular apomorphies, which tends to focus considerations about the origin of a group on a relatively short segment of the stem lineage in which the particular apomorphy originated. In contrast, the integrated approach broadens the concept of origins to the entire stem lineage. Here's an example involving snakes. Under traditional views, as illustrated on the left, the origin of snakes is commonly thought of as the short segment of the stem lineage associated with body elongation and the reduction or loss of limb. However, snakes have many other distinctive characters relative to other extant organisms, some of which likely arose much earlier and others much later than body elongation and limb reduction. By deriving the name of the total clade from that of the crown, the integrated approach effectively treats the origin of snakes as the history of the entire stem lineage, as illustrated on the right. And this perspective has the added benefit of highlighting the wealth of transitional forms in groups with good fossil records, which seems particularly important in light of renewed attacks on the teaching of evolution. For example, in contrast with traditional views in which only those fossils close to the origin of wings and flight, fossils such as Archaeopteryx, are considered intermediate between reptiles in the paraphyletic sense and birds, the integrated approach highlights that there are literally hundreds of transitional forms. They include some extinct forms that are much more distant from modern birds than is Archaeopteryx, for example, sauropod dinosaurs, and others that are much closer to modern birds, such as the short-tailed but toothed Ichthyornis. And finally, another advantage of the integrated approach is that it would bring consistency to neontological and paleontological usage. The problem here is that although neontologists and paleontologists generally claim to use the same names for the same taxa, in practice neontologists tend to use the best known names for the crowns, ignoring less well-known names that have been proposed explicitly for those clades. For example, despite the explicit proposal of the name Lysamphibia for the amphibian crown clade, as illustrated here, neontologists almost always use the better-known name Amphibia when talking about extant species alone. Thus, we have names such as the Amphibian Ark, Global Amphibian Assessment, the Amphibian Conservation Summit, the Amphibian Specialist Group, Amphibiatry, Amphibiaweb, and countless books on the amphibians of geographic region X, all of which should really be using the name Lis Amphibia, since members of the STEM group aren't included in these words. However, if the best known name Amphibia were to be assigned to the crown, then all of those inconsistencies would vanish. So to wrap it up, an integrated approach to naming clades would have some important benefits. It would increase nomenclatural precision, and it would do so efficiently. It would broaden the concept of origins for distinctive clades of extant organisms, thus highlighting the wealth of evolutionary intermediates for many such clades. And it would unify neontological and paleontological usage. To achieve such a system, some concessions would have to be made concerning both the references of particular names and the names of particular clades. The result, however, would be a system that better meets the needs of biology as a whole. Thanks for listening.
So I know that some people are going to have to leave now who have classes, etc. So for those of you who'd like to go, you can file on out. And then I'm going to let Kevin handle his own questions since Craig's not here. But I want to mention also that for those of you who are interested, we're going to be going out to lunch afterwards, and anybody's invited to come along if they'd like.
I had a question, which is, I mean, let's just say we all agree that clades are really important and that you know, you should only have clades as taxa. I'm not sure that it follows that the name should actually be attached to clades. So for example, when I explain to students the importance of clades, I say things like, look, fish aren't a clade, that's why Pisces is not a taxa, etc. You know, fish means exactly what you think it does, right? But if you attach names to clades, like, so for example, with reptiles, you know, you might say something like, well, reptile means what you thought it did, it just turns out they're not a clade, they're not a taxa. Or you could say, which, you know, if we had named reptiles 100 years ago or something, it might turn out that birds are reptiles, and that reptile still is a clade. But with some names that seems to me okay. Maybe, you know, I might accept that birds are reptiles, but for example, I definitely wouldn't think that we're fish, right? And so with your, like for example, your termite cockroach example, I think you're saying termites are cockroaches. So on the newer view, but another option, it seems to me, would be to say, actually, you know, Blatodia, they are cockroaches. That means just what you thought. It's just they're not a clade, so they're not a taxa anymore. And
actually, while you're responding to his question, I was sitting here thinking WWJD, what would Joe tells us not to do? So he would ask the following questions, and prefacing this by saying, all else being equal, I'm all in favor of things being, you know, named according to trees. But you know, in his book Inferring Phylogenies, he coined a new school, which is it just doesn't matter school. Right, and his argument was that practicing biologists who are doing this, using phylogenies, actually use the phylogenies correctly. The independent contrast is correctly on the tree, or the map of characters correctly on the tree. So while you're addressing his question, you can deal with Joe's question as well.
Yeah, so in that case, I mean, I think, I don't disagree with Joe about that, but I think what he's overlooking is the fact that people do need to refer to things. And it's, you know, instead of having to put up a tree every time and point to all the species in that clade, it's much more convenient to say mammalia or something. You know? And so, I mean, I think he's sort of overlooking some things that maybe don't affect his world as much, but affect that of other practicing biologists more. Then on to the first question. I think there are several issues going on there, one of which is, you know, first, there's a distinction between these formal taxon names and also just names that, there are lots of other names. Like there are all kinds of names that exist in every language that are not formal taxon names. And so this idea of attaching taxon names to clades is talking only about these formal taxon names, and it's following this tradition that goes back to Darwin of this idea that these taxon names should refer to strictly genealogical units or entities. So it's not to say that you can't use other terms, other names effectively, that don't refer to clades. And in fact, you even notice that when I was talking about the vernacular names that might be useful in referring to, in in the context of this integrated system, one of those vernacular names doesn't refer to a clade. When you talk about, for example, stem birds or stem mammals, that actually refers to a paraphyletic group. And people, I think, have taken that fact, people who've advocated this sort of everything is clades approach have taken it to the extreme that we shouldn't even use terms like that. But I think they're missing the point. I think the point is, no, maybe we shouldn't have a formal taxon name that refers to that group, but the notion of all those members of the total clade that are not members of the crown is still a useful term to have in certain types of discussions, and I think it facilitates. Well, if you think about it in the context of mammals, I think in the context of mammals, the alternative to that, to saying stem mammals or something, would be either to use a formal paraphyletic taxon. I don't know if there actually was one. There's some that refer to intermediate clades that are paraphyletic. Well, no, I think the name Synapsida originally referred to a paraphyletic taxon that didn't include mammals. It was the synapsid reptiles, for example. But if people were opposed to having a formal name like that, then their alternative is to come up with a very cumbersome name that probably nobody would recognize, like non-mammalian theropsids, or something like that. And it's like, who knows what that is? Well, on the other hand, if you just say stem mammals, it's very obvious what that group collection refers to. Yeah, Chuck.
Yeah, actually, I think there's a little bit of a conflation here between words like reptiles and reptilia. And so reptilia is a formal name, but reptiles is not. And if you look at other kinds of common names like fish is not a formal name, but neither is tortoise or turtle. And depending on where you are in the world, tortoise and turtle mean different things.